I have been so lucky and fortunate. If I'm not using that to work on something that like moves the world forward in some way, like how can I expect anyone else to?
Can you try to describe how you think?
It's very closed loop. It's hard to like, do you want me to just turn this on and we can start?
No, we'll keep going.
Keep going.
This is part of it. I love it.
Olympic athletes like win and lose races by milliseconds. Why isn't it unreasonable to think that startup success and failure can be the same? I have always been deep on the side of prove it.
We're here in the factory of Unspun in Oakland, California with CTO, COO, Kevin Martin of Unspun. This is really cool to be here and see this because I actually interviewed at Unspun, I think like 2 years ago probably. Yeah. And you guys at that time had an incredible machine prototype. Now you've got 5 machines, a larger facility, and you're getting ready to build a lot more. Can you give a quick kind of definition explanation of what Unspun does to those who haven't watched the main episode?
Yeah, totally. So Unspun is thinking about a more sustainable and more profitable way of producing clothes for the apparel industry, fundamentally by automating how that manufacturing process works. So can we go from a really manual, labor-intensive, foreign factory base for cheap labor type process and evolve the overall system to something that's local, small footprint, automated, and fundamentally on demand. And so we really think of ourselves as that intersection of like automation and robotics to a very manual and historically offline world.
And there's like a lot of stuff we couldn't film today, which was really cool stuff. And I'm curious, can you give a quick explanation of what it was roughly and why we can't film it?
Unspun's core technology is 3D weaving, and it's a really manual, massive industrial process about the size of a semi-truck. It's about 3,000 individual actuators, about as many unique parts as a Tesla Model 3. It's a pretty massive system. And the interesting approach that we're taking in automating apparel manufacturing is not just like pluck out the human and drop in robotic arms in the exact same seat, but rather like rethink the overall process, like going from fibers to yarns as normal, but then yarn to garment in as few steps as possible. So it's a really process reliant innovation and something that we spent so much time on. We now have about probably a 3 to 5 year head start on anyone else that wants to think about automating that core apparel manufacturing process. So we are really, really secretive about what our machines look like. There's no photos online. We're building 2 big hubs, one in North America and one in Europe, and we'll build out hundreds of machines there. So our goal is to be doing hundreds of millions in revenue before anyone really knows how we're even doing this.
We know a lot about Unspun, especially if you watch the main episode. But what I'm interested in is your journey into founding it. I hear there's a cool one relating to GoPros, robots, and K-pop.
Yeah, so I grew up in a military family. I wanted to be a fighter pilot for as long as I could say those words, probably.
I feel like you'd be a good fighter pilot, actually.
In a parallel universe, I think I'm still having a lot of fun at it. Yeah, and that was kind of my full obsession. Grew up with an ejection seat in the living room, mangled up F-16 fan blades on my desk.
Wait, how did you get an ejection seat?
My dad was an F-16 pilot and ejected out of his plane. So growing up, I would bring the car home. And he's like, "Kevin, you like scuffed the sidewall of the wheels." I was like, "Dad, you rammed your F-16 into the field of Turkey." It actually was more of like a production emergency. The like throttle choke got stuck on his plane. But yeah, just like really grew up thinking about machines, aviation, wanting to fly. Took the ACT, I don't even know how many times, 8, 9, something like that, like all consumed on this one life path. And because I wanted to fly so much, I was then, okay, well, how can I fly as a young kid? It was kind of in that like RC planes and then the very early days of FPV, and kind of stumbled into my first job by convincing this RC magazine that I was way older than I really was so that I could write reviews. And that meant I would just get mailed free RC plane stuff. So really kind of got to see the very early days of drones, like cameras on remote controlled things generally. And it eventually evolved into like a full-fledged business, kind of like started my first company, more of a small business than anything venture-backed. But we did robotic camera motion of drones early on. We helped GoPro build one of their first flying things way back when they were just a few, maybe a dozen people. And then quickly pivoted into cable cameras. It was like, we would get a call like, hey, can you come fly your flying thing over this like massive crowd at Red Rocks? And maybe you get away with it once or twice, and then the insurance people find out and they're like, sorry, what? You want to fly this 30-pound weight over 30,000 people with 6 razor blades spinning at Mach 0.8? No. So yeah, we became a cable cam company. And rather than being an engineering business like I had hoped, it just made better sense to show up with it, film with it, and lead with it. So I keep the voicemail on my phone of coming out of a grocery store, had a missed call from some international number, and it's like, hey, Kevin, I got your number from so-and-so. I heard you all are the best in the world at filming K-pop with robots. And yeah, it was like my big wake-up moment of, fuck, is that what I'm here to do? And not to rag on K-pop or robots even for that matter, but I had just always felt like I have been so lucky and fortunate, and like, from the human card game, like I got dealt such an incredible hand, and if I'm not using that to work on something that like moves the world forward in some way, like how can I expect anyone else to? So I sold the company. I was just cruising around the internet thinking about like what are the core ingredients of the future I want to believe in. And as any good millennial, I met a couple strangers online and made a really long-term life decision based on that. So my 2 co-founders actually met from just a job posting on Angel's List, actually.
Talk me through your meeting co-founders, and did they initially already have the idea and they're like, build us the robot, or was it state zero?
Yeah, definitely. So my co-founder Beth is the like true visionary of Unspun, and thinking about this process from her background in the apparel industry and seeing how wasteful it could be, and really leaning into thinking about like, okay, what would it look like to just radically rethink the whole process and start over. And yeah, the way that Beth's brain works as a designer and very much as that like person who sees into the future is so complementary and powerful to like my very engineering logic conversion driven brain of like just get to the right solution. So I think Beth really thinking about like the what if, or like how could we, and then my other co-founder Walden really coming from the supply chain and business model side of how the fashion industry works and projecting out what's going to be popular 12, 18 months from now. Both of them have kind of independently landed on this idea of what would it take to produce on demand, and had some of the initial thoughts around this core concept of 3D weaving. Very similar to like basket weaving, if you've ever seen that. Like it's a very 3D process, but it's all seamless and woven, but there's really no industrial version of that. So I met them at about that stage, and I was really looking for a media engineering problem to jump into. And then we spent probably about 2 or 3 years effectively as just like a privately funded, PhD project type thing where we had grants from the National Science Foundation to think about future of manufacturing and additive manufacturing technology, and spent quite a while trying to build some early prototypes to prove that this idea of 3D weaving could even work. So after we spent the first 3-ish years of our life, it really is like a slow growth grant-funded project. That was when we finally started to have enough technology and traction to say, hey, this really should be a venture-backed business, and now we need to build these machines as fast and quickly and quietly as we can.
What was one of the hardest personal technical challenges of building either the prototypes or the current version of the machine?
Yeah, I mean, hardware is just hard. Like entropy creeps in everywhere. Think you've got everything figured out, and then boom, the Red Sea's closed, and now all of your build timelines are wrecked because ships aren't moving, or you're trying to go back and forth and can't figure out why the prototype machine's functioning some days and other days it's not, and then it's actually because the relative humidity in your factory is fluctuating 4%. And it's just so many things that you're just like, of course that's it. So yeah, there's just constant stories of things like that. Early on, we really needed to do a lot of like high-speed cycle time. So we went and moved to Shenzhen. We lived in Shenzhen for like 6 months.
Wow.
Really got to see, the speed that ecosystem operates of like, you could send a part out before you left the office at night. By the time you were at your desk at 9 a.m., the machine part was there. You could test it, try something else, get out a new rev, go to lunch, start working on something after lunch, and you have that rev then, for an hour or two before you left. Like you could get 3 machined aluminum hardware cycles in a day. And that's just unfathomable to like the network and the manufacturing base that exists in the US. So I think really getting to see, how quickly manufacturing can go elsewhere, the importance of automation if the United States is really going to compete on an industrial scale, or even should it just be self-sufficient. All of those, I think, were some pretty massive learnings for us in getting to this part now where we've got, this semi-truck size machine with 3,000 actuators, 40,000 movements a second. It's absolutely a dream or worst nightmare, depending on how caffeinated you are at the time, I think.
How does, in your opinion, the U.S. catch up to Shenzhen?
I think it fundamentally needs to be playing different games. I think if you want to just play a one-for-one game, it's going to be really hard. And certainly in some ways we need to. Like the United States needs to figure out how to produce aluminum and PCBs and do all sorts of manufacturing. But a U.S. market is never going to get to direct one-to-one if it's still like a human-based process. So automation is fundamentally, I believe, the only way we can really compete at that level, and building new like technology and software-heavy versions of things rather than trying to, enter the rat race of just the manual, like, can you just throw 1,000 bodies at the problem type process. So yeah, it's a lot of automation. It's thinking big picture. It's, rather than just plucking out the human and recreating the apparel soft goods assembly line, like, can you zoom out and think about how do you go from fibers to garment as fast as possible? My favorite engineering saying on the factory floor is like, the most efficient way to do something's not to do it. Like, rather than competing at that one-for-one level, like, what are the things that we actually need to do? And can we skip a lot of those intermediate steps too?
What are some of the biggest learnings you've had as a technical founder of Unspun? You guys have gone insanely fast, built a ton of hardware, very quietly. It's really impressive. What are the main learnings from that?
I think, there's so many cool Instagram or YouTube videos or Twitter threads on like early startup, American dynamism type posts. And yes, like building tech really fast is important. Making sure you're equally riding those like press waves as you make things is important as well. But gravity will always catch up with you. And one of the things you cannot not think about is the team and the group of people that you put together, especially at the early stage. I don't think people realize like how locked in your team and culture and attitude of the company really starts solidifying in those like 0 to 10 people stage, and how like the issues that companies have later on often trace back to that. And especially for the companies that are doing really well and are really popular at the beginning, that saying like nothing covers up scary problems like product market fit. There's no way around all of those things. Like, you still need to be thinking about building a culture of people who want to jump in and work hard, and like, are these people right to be at your startup is another big one. But at the same time, how do we make sure we're, building quickly, but also building a culture and a team that, not only your engineers want to be at, but your technicians, everything else that goes along with it. So yeah, I think time and time again reminded how important the number one decision and biggest impact as a founder you ever really make is like, who are the other people you bring through the door and get to put the uniform on.
I don't think anyone else can hear it. There's this like ambient lo-fi you guys have going in the factory, and this is just the way to do an interview or work. It's so pleasant.
I have lots of pet peeve quirks, and one of them is that like there should always be quiet music in the background. And so we've rigged every room in our whole factory and office that there is always quiet music playing in the background.
I love it.
On an automatic schedule. So even if you turn it off, it'll turn itself back on.
That might be annoying.
Yeah, when you're doing interviews and you want it to stop, maybe. Yeah, I think one of the big pitfalls that gets missed early on is the like, if you build it, they will come type thinking. Like I think engineers are particularly susceptible to like, wow, if I just make this thing that hasn't existed before, it's all gravy from there, right? But so many other like really, really important foundational decisions go into that can make or break a company. And there are things that, probably in those early days when someone's like, oh, I'm really going to start this company doing this, like they're not thinking about the equity versus debt structure of how they're going to, fund the capex of this deployment. And they're not thinking about like, tax advantages or opportunity zones and like where maybe the best place to set up that first factory is. So yes, engineering and hardware is a foundational problem to solve, but that alone isn't enough. And, hey, deep tech founders, you also really need that like brilliantly smart commercial team thinking about, how are you getting people to pay for it? What are your customers currently worried about? How are they used to paying for things? How are they used to fighting against paying for things? The commercialization side and making sure you're not locking yourself into bad models early on from just not spending the effort to think about it, I think can be a massive sticking point.
This next question is a little weird, but I like asking founders this. Can you try to describe how you think? Like, do you have any mental models or lenses you commonly use to think about the world?
I think every single person at Unspun would tell you that I'm a goldfish and that I have the world's worst memory. And sometimes that's an advantage. And I think I can beat my head against brick walls longer than other people can. But obviously things that come with that of like just rattling off like a list of memorized numbers and variables is super hard for me. So I think learning to live with my own brain has really forced me to think about everything, from a very first principles perspective. Like I need to be able to derive that same solution each time rather than just remember that I had derived it to that point. And so, yeah, I think being able to think of those like first principles ingredients of like, yes, what is the engineering problem that you're thinking about? Yes, what resources do we have? But also like, who are the people that we're solving this problem with? And like zooming out to like the human engineering side. That has often felt like potentially a, superpower or thing I'm able to see that's often the blind spot of others is like, yes, what is the technical solution we're going after here? But, down to even the little things of like, well, yes, this is a big commercial negotiation, but hey, really, I think this person is motivated because they care less about how much they're about to pay, but they want to feel like they're really important to the rest of the team there. So yeah, I think thinking from those very high level angles of the ingredients going into a question and making sure you're considering all of those is often my initial framework.
Normally I just like ask this question, but I actually feel like I'm not 100% sure you would agree with like the postulate of it. So I'm going to like cool. ask you on the first half of it. You guys walk a very interesting line between fashion and deep tech hardware manufacturing. Super cool. It's hardware and software or yarnware.
There you go. SOFTWEAR.
So I feel like you guys have a great pulse on culture as well as like the little deep tech bubble that we operate in. And I'm curious what your view of like Gen Z plus millennial plus alpha a little bit sort of is. I feel like personally there's a lot of concerns about it. Other people have concerns too. I'm curious, like before I ask my next question, like what do you think about like how is the generation doing compared to other generations with the current stack of problems and benefits that it has?
Working in the fashion industry definitely puts you right on the leading edge of culture in a lot of senses.
Yeah.
And there's smaller bubbles of this. I think Twitter is a great one. Like at least for the deep tech world, generally most people live on the leading edge of culture there. And like if Sam Altman has said something this morning, like you and I probably would know about it and be tweeting about it. But that bubble's smaller. Where culture and fashion is a bit more at the global scale, even down to trends like our skinny jeans or wide leg jeans in that kind of thing often gets influenced from, a group of kids in a Nordic country at first, or then like everyone realizing that the like postal service uniforms in Germany look really cool or something like that.
Or
so
America.
in America, yeah. And so yeah, I think getting to see the ripples of culture move quickly in the fashion industry also kind of exacerbates how much like this shift from very local, small bubble thinking to like a much more global scale. I think Gen Z is absolutely thinking more on their immediate world is not just the town they grew up in, but it's what's happening in the Middle East, and to the level that they're much more vocal and outraged about things like that. So yeah, I think it's fundamentally a big shift towards a significantly more global world versus like a very isolationist or pre-technology like thinking that like, oh well, the other part of the world is just so far away. Thinking about where are my clothes manufactured? Like the people asking that are almost always the younger generation, and caring about like, well, I want to buy products that were made ethically. I think it's a generation that's certainly grown up with a much more significant awareness of what's happening elsewhere.
You're one of the first people other than myself I've heard talk about like our base stats in life are really cracked. Like we come from good sort of families. It sounds like a time where technology's connected everyone, making everyone think more globally. And I often personally find myself thinking a lot about how I wish Gen Z was doing more with that. And I feel like often we're not.
Yeah.
And so normally my question is like, I take that as like a granted fact and ask like, how do we inspire Gen Z to do more? But I almost wonder if you feel like that, or if you feel like, no, the kids are fine. Like we're growing up, it's okay.
I think it's bifurcated. I think there's a certain section where, humans have inherently always dealt with struggle and strife in some sense. Maybe even to a level that as you depending on how much struggle you actually experience, like you just kind of recalibrate and can remain equally outraged about things. So yeah, I think in some sense you do see Gen Z kids like pushing the world forward, taking public office in South Bay, really thinking about their responsibility in being the change that they want to see in the world. But I definitely think there's, an equivalent side where people can just grow up in this, like, I must be outraged all the time. And so, yeah, I generally would say that I think we're all right. I think the kids are okay. But when I say that, it's because I'm so inspired by the ones that are like, I'm going to go fucking fix that.
Right.
Because I think that's the skill and leverage against the world that actually does move things forward. So, it's like a very rare thing, but super cool.
Well, it's awesome to not have to ask that question or make that same assumption with you. I think I too agree with that in a lot of ways. Is there any research or technology kind of in the next 5 or 10 years you sort of see coming, or fields that are really interesting to you?
To be in the mechanical engineering robotics world right now is so cool. We're really leaving one era and starting another. If you haven't been following, like all the humanoid robots suddenly functioning is not because we got much better at the old way of thinking. It's because we found a new way of thinking. Like the automation has always been this world of like, blindfold your friend, dump them in a room and tell them like, take 3 steps forward, raise your left arm, like grab the thing. And it's very closed loop. It's hard to like learn and imagine. Do you want me to just turn this on and we can start?
No, we'll keep going.
Keep going.
This is part of it. I love it.
And now we're entering a world where, robotics programming is more like run a bunch of simulations and figure out how to pick up that thing off the shelf and put it over there. And we're continuing to be able to think more layers abstracted away from like motors spinning on a machine. So yeah, I think one of the big changes happening in the world right now is going to be this world of robotics, and it's such an incredible time to be part of it. And then I think it's going to continue to be the like what happens as technology becomes more available everywhere. Even in our own world, like yes, we are automating manufacturing. We are automating a job that historically been done by low income, poor people in third world countries. Every time I get asked to speak at a conference, they're like, come defend this. Like, how could you? But I think the flip side of that question is like, well, actually what you're doing is you're taking these very like centralized, monopolized manufacturing processes and making them fit inside a shipping container. And now that like tiny island in the Philippines that's used to getting 3 boats a year of goods now can have their own factory. And I think this like, how does the world shift and evolve as technology becomes more equally distributed is really cool. Particularly in the realm of like, how do you bring up and up level, the lower third of humanity in terms of like conditions that we're living in. I think Africa evolving is going to be fascinating. Like so many of the issues that the US even faces in terms of infrastructure, and what currently exists because of decisions 20 years ago. But, what if you could build grids today from scratch? How would they look differently? Probably designed for two-way power, right? Versus just like from a power plant one directionally to being used. So the amount of opportunity, I think, and like, again, that Venn diagram overlap of like profitability and sustainability, or profitability and like better environmental conditions for people. And maybe this is just the techno optimist in me speaking, but it's cool to think about everything that's coming.
I often think a lot about too how when more technology will sort of take away lower wage work from people. I think a lot about this a lot with AI in advanced manufacturing. How do we make sure it's redistributed properly? Do you think about this often? Do you have any theories on this?
You're in ground zero of this, right? Like, where did computers come from? If you run that back, you get to punch cards, but punch cards were actually just jacquard looms. They were literally these weaving machines that had these big wooden boards with holes in it that would clack through, and that's how you changed the pattern. And, if you call someone a Luddite for being against technology, like those were the people in factories in Europe that were upset that like this machine had automated their job of like pulling these things up and down. Which is all to say, like, technology making certain jobs obsolete is not new. This has been going on always, and it will continue to go on always. So we think about our role in this process as, one, this is like a natural evolution, and there are absolutely jobs that humans shouldn't do. But two, to that point of like, how do you then make sure that it's equally distributed? I think you kind of have two paths to take. One is like, you can really wrap yourself up in trying to like unnaturally force it in certain ways. And I think policy sometimes gets caught up in that. Or you just keep boiling it back down to like, if you just make a cheap, affordable version of this, then it can be equally distributed. So I think it's maintaining that like, this has to be a capitalist pursuit that ultimately means that like, there's countries in Africa with no infrastructure, but everyone has a cell phone. And like, yes, we need to work on those other things, but the fact that everyone has a cell phone is such a testament to like technology innovating and capitalism progressing, ultimately uplifting everyone at the same time.
My last question for you, also another weird question, but again, I think it's cool to ask founders. How would you describe your current life philosophy?
I think I have always been deep on the side of like, prove it. The most impressive thing to me is like 6-8 years of grind for someone to get to where they are. I think there's certainly multiple paths to success, and there's definitely a path to success in being able to finesse and play the PR game and smooth talk well. And maybe I'm just not smart enough for that route. So I think my life philosophy has always been, I will never be the smartest person in the room. I'm probably not the most eloquent, but I'm pretty damn sure I can outwork them. And it's definitely a grind type mentality. And I don't think I would be able to do it forever. But I do think there's something just like deeply satisfying in being able to work really, really hard and put yourself into like whole self into something. Olympic athletes like win and lose races by milliseconds. Like, why isn't it unreasonable to think that startup success and failure can be the same? And yeah, being able to really put everything into it. And I think it even goes back to like, I wear these goofy USPS jackets of 1980s, 1990s era with the eagle. And I'm just so in love with the branding of it. I think because like, you know, maybe in the AI world, like the cool, sexy branding is like black with some purple and like, that's iconic. But shit, you cannot replicate like 15 years of sun-faded walking in the sun back and forth. So yeah, I think generally my life philosophy has been like based on what I'm good at. Unfortunately, I'm probably the best one to go play these like really hard games that take 6, 8, 10 years of beating your head against the wall. Because I'm such a goldfish, I keep forgetting that I'm doing it. So
That's an awesome answer. Kevin, thanks for taking the time, and thanks for building Unspun.
yeah, thank you. This was fun.
We did it.
Did it.
Oh man, this was awesome.
Sorry that the